Francis Hayman, Hayman. Hayman's The Milkman's Garland from 1741–1742 is one of fewer than a dozen surviving pictures on painted panels by Hayman and his assistants between 1738 and 60 to decorate Vauxhall Gardens, Vauxhall, in London. By the 1740s, the gardens boasted of more than 50 panels, most fitted into the back of the supper boxes, which surrounded the grove, which we see here in this popular illustration. This was the focal point of the garden around the orchestra pavilion. Most of these panels were designed and partly painted by Hayman. More of the paintings depicted popular pastimes, games, and leisure activities, interspersed with theatrical, historical, and genre subjects. The chief purpose was decorative, although verses were attached to engravings after some of the pictures, as one saw in France at the time. The supper box, or arbor, was an ornate wooden shelter formed by two side walls and a roof, framing picturesque views through the gardens, where guests could take supper. At a certain moment in the evening entertainment, the paintings were left fall to enclose the diners from the back. The front was left permanently open for the fashionable occupants to view and be viewed. One of the ancient customs observed on May Day that still existed in the 19th century was the milkmaid garland, a painting that we see here. Though milkmaids would dress in their best clothes and dance in the streets for their customers, a donation from customers and passers-by was expected. A garland was a pyramid of borrowed silver tankards, plates, and flagons that were decorated with flowers. The garland was paraded by the milkmaids, or carried, as seen here, by a porter or two. Hayman includes another May Day custom here, that is, that of the young chimney sweeps, noisily beating their brushes and shovels. Hayman began as a scene painter, then turned to portraiture. These large paintings at Spring Garden marked his first large decorative commission. The commission came from Hayman's patron, the entrepreneur Jonathan Tyers, Tyers, who held the lease on Spring Gardens and was responsible for opening them to the public in 1732. The cheerful scene was a well-known sight of May Day in London until the early 19th century. The milkmaids danced before their customers' doors. The garland was carried by one or two porters or by the milkmaids. The figures have been put into an imaginary Italianate rural setting appropriate for the season and the open-air setting. This painting is by Joseph Highmore. It is entitled Mr. Oldham and His Guests. It dates about 1745. It's an oil on canvas. It's in the Tate Gallery in London. The conversation piece was losing its popularity in the 1740s, but continued to exist past mid-century, as William Vaughan notes in his book. We see a focus on close-up intimacy by major painter Highmore, who was Hogarth's chief rival in the 1730s and 1740s. Painted for Nathaniel Oldham to commemorate a dinner party at his home. Oldham came home from hunting so late that the friends he invited to dinner ate without him. He found them relaxing with a bowl of hot wine. Oldham appears on the far left. In the center, holding a pipe, is a neighboring farmer. His friend, a local schoolmaster, holds a blue and white bowl. Between them, wearing a red velvet cap, is Joseph Highmore himself, Oldham's close friend who was commissioned to paint the scene. John Thomas Smith, the picture's owner, wrote in 1827 that the picture was put in his sleeping room when he was a child. His father told him the picture's story. Oldham's house was in Ealing. He was wrapped up in his hunting and did not arrive home until his guests had dined. He had earlier invited them. And then he found them so comfortably seated with their pipes over a bowl of magus that he commissioned Highmore to paint the scene and desired that he might be introduced in it just as he had appeared at that time. The right figure, the schoolmaster, had a white wig and black coat. The farmer in the center was also from Ealing. Nathaniel Oldham had served with the army in India in his youth, but retired on inheriting a fortune to pursue his interests as an extravagant collector of curiosities and as a patron of the arts and of the turf. His enthusiasm eventually bankrupted him, and he apparently died a debtor in the King's Bench prison. Oldham was apparently very intimate with Highmore, who painted a full-length portrait of him in green hunting attire. Oldham owned Ealing House from 1728 to June 1735. His very large collection was sold off while he was still living at Cox's in February of 1747. Oldham took refuge from his creditors for a while in the sanctuary of the Court of St. James, where he took to appearing in the refreshment room on Duck Island in St. James Park, wearing eccentric costume and playing several instruments for the amusement of his guests. William Hogarth, Captain Thomas Coram, 1740. Thomas Coram Foundation in London. Hogarth painted this portrait soon after Coram had received the Foundling Hospital's Royal Charter, the seal which he is artfully holding in his right hand. In the background there is a reference to the sea and to shipping, which was his former business before he retired in 1719 at the age of 51, to devote himself in the remainder of his life to philanthropic work. The globe at his feet shows the Atlantic Ocean where he practiced his trade. The wall to the right, behind Coram, is a painting or relief sculpture showing charity nurturing children, a reference to the sitter's role as one of the governors of the Foundling Hospital in London. Here, a self-made man, he is elevated in stature through the grand painterly and compositional style of Baroque portraiture. The sitter is of undisguised humble origin, on a stage reserved for noblemen and statesmen. Aesthetic beliefs. It represents the artist in a still life composition, as if painted in an unframed oval, which is supported by 3 volumes of Shakespeare, Milton, and Swift, whose works he much admired. His painting, or painting generally, is viewed to be on equal footing with drama, satire, and epic poetry, represented by these great authors. On Hogarth's palette, in the left foreground, is a serpentine line with the inscription, "The Line of Beauty." Hogarth would discuss this aesthetic that fused the ideal and real, founded on the ancient Greeks and Michelangelo, in his famous essay on painting. In the right foreground of this painting sits Hogarth's pug, probably Trump, who represents everyday naturalism as compared to the ideal in the left front corner. Hogarth was very much attached to Trump and was known to have remarked on the resemblance between Trump and himself. Roubilliac, the sculptor, was known to have sculpted Hogarth as well as Trump. Only the porcelain reproduction of Trump survives. An engraving of this portrait here was used by Hogarth as the initial page to bound copies of his engraved works.